In June 1941, an eerie calm lay over Eastern Europe. The roads of Poland were alive with German convoys hidden beneath camouflage nets. Yet to the ordinary eye, nothing seemed unusual. Along the Bug River, Soviet border guards carried out their patrols lazily, unaware that the most destructive invasion in human history was only hours away. For months, within the heart of Germany, secret preparations had been underway. In every railway station, every barracks, every officer's office, fragments of a single grand plan came together. Operation Barbarossa. It was a plan designed to reshape the fate of Europe. Hitler saw this campaign as his masterpiece, the decisive blow that would destroy the Soviet Union before winter arrived. He imagined himself as the conqueror of the East, the man who would erase Bolshevism from the map. 3 million soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 3,000 tanks, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. The largest army the world had ever seen stood ready to move. Their eyes were fixed on the east. Every route, every target was chosen. Army Group North would strike toward Leningrad, the center toward Moscow, and the south toward the vast fields of Ukraine. On maps, these red arrows looked clean, precise, and certain. But behind every line drawn was the life of a son, a husband, a brother. In Moscow, however, there was no sign of alarm. Radios played cheerful music, newspapers praised peace, and Stalin's circle remained convinced that the friendship pact with Germany would hold. Stalin himself refused to believe the warnings. He told his generals that Hitler would never risk a second front while Britain still resisted. The Soviet intelligence reports about German troop buildups, air reconnaissance, and deserters' confessions were all dismissed as provocations. In the fortress town of Brest, life went on as usual. Soldiers wrote letters to their families, others cleaned rifles, some even planned to go fishing the next morning. On the night of June 21st, the air smelled faintly of rain. Someone played an accordion, others laughed over a card game. No one imagined what the coming dawn would bring. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, the earth shook. The first explosions thundered across Brest. The night sky turned red with fire. Over 3,000 German guns roared to life in unison. The invasion of the Soviet Union had begun. The Bug River was ablaze, the horizon a sea of orange and black. Within minutes, communications collapsed. Radios went silent. Commanders vanished. Chaos consumed the frontier. In the fortress, men stumbled from their beds, grabbing weapons in panic. Some didn't even have time to dress. From Lithuania to Ukraine, the world was on fire. The Luftwaffe swept over Soviet airfields, turning them into burning graveyards of steel. Hundreds of planes were destroyed before they could even take off. By 5 a.m, the scope of the disaster was clear. Stalin was still asleep when an officer entered his office with a trembling voice. "Comrade Stalin, the Germans have attacked." For a moment, Stalin said nothing. Then quietly, almost in disbelief, he asked, "Is it a provocation?" But no one could answer him. This was no provocation. It was war, total war. In Brest, the defenders refused to surrender. The Germans expected to take the fortress in a single day. Instead, the battle dragged on for weeks. The walls cracked under constant shelling, but the Soviet soldiers fought on, room by room, stone by stone. Blood, smoke, and fire filled the air. Every inch of ground was paid for with lives. That morning, the world changed forever. The ground was soaked with blood, the air shook with explosions, and millions of lives were thrown into the inferno. It was the beginning of the most brutal war the modern world had ever seen. On that day, June 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler woke the sleeping giant. The Soviet Union would bleed, it would suffer, but it would not die. And when it rose again, it would turn the fire back toward Berlin. That dawn left a scar on humanity that would never fade. The frozen road to Moscow. By late September 1941, the vast plains of Eastern Europe were littered with the wreckage of Hitler's ambitions. Operation Barbarossa, which had begun with breathtaking speed, was now sinking into the mud and misery of the Russian autumn. The German army, which had marched through the summer sun, now faced endless rain, broken roads, and a relentless enemy that refused to die. Every kilometer east felt heavier than the last. In the beginning, they had called it a blitzkrieg, a lightning war. But the lightning had dimmed, and the thunder was fading. The Wehrmacht had encircled Kiev, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, but the victory came at cost. Hitler's generals warned him. The army was exhausted, supplies were low, and winter was coming. But Hitler, blinded by arrogance, ordered them to press on toward Moscow. As the days grew shorter, the landscape transformed into a nightmare. Tanks sank into mud. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers marched with soaked boots that froze overnight. Trucks carrying ammunition were abandoned in ditches. The Luftwaffe struggled to fly through stormy skies, and the once invincible German divisions began to crumble under their own weight. Soviet partisans emerged from forests and villages, ambushing convoys and cutting communication lines. The German soldiers began to understand something terrifying. This was not France. This was not Poland. This was Russia, and it would not yield easily. Meanwhile, Stalin had found his moment. For months he had hidden behind paranoia and silence, but now his voice echoed across the Soviet Union. Not one step back, he declared. The factories of the Ural Mountains thundered day and night. Women, children, and old men forged tanks, bullets, and dreams of revenge. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, was reborn in the ashes of its defeat. Thousands of new recruits arrived from Siberia, tough, disciplined, used to the cold. They had one mission: defend Moscow at any cost. By October, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the final push to capture the Soviet capital. Columns of tanks and infantry stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Hitler believed the war would end before the snow fell. Instead, the first flakes began to drift down as his troops reached the outskirts of Moscow. The temperature plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze. Rifles jammed. Men wrapped themselves in stolen Soviet coats, newspapers, and curtains just to survive the night. Frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. In the distance, they could see the faint glow of Moscow's lights. But the closer they came, the harder the resistance grew. Soviet snipers haunted the forests. Artillery thundered from hidden positions. Civilians dug trenches beside soldiers, ready to defend their homes with bare hands. When the German tanks finally bogged down in the snow, the Red Army struck back with fury. The counteroffensive began on December 5, 1941. Out of the blizzard, Siberian divisions descended like ghosts. They knew how to fight in the cold. The Germans did not. The myth of German invincibility shattered that winter. Hitler's army, the same force that had conquered half of Europe, was now retreating through snow and blood. For the first time, the German soldier looked east and understood the truth. The war would not end quickly. The road to Moscow had become a graveyard of steel and dreams. And as dawn broke over the frozen fields, the world realized that the sleeping giant had truly awakened. The Red Army bleeds, but does not fall. By early 1942, the true scale of Operation Barbarossa's failure became undeniable. The German Wehrmacht, once seemingly unstoppable, had pushed deep into Soviet territory, but Moscow still stood, defiant and resolute. The early months of the invasion had been a bloodbath. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and countless smaller towns had fallen. Millions of soldiers had died, and millions more had been captured. Entire divisions vanished under the crushing tide of German armored columns. Yet despite this devastation, the Soviet Union refused to collapse. Everywhere, ordinary citizens transformed into soldiers. Factories hummed with ceaseless activity as women and children worked side by side with engineers and technicians. Ammunition, tanks, rifles, and aircraft were produced at a staggering pace. From Siberia to the Urals, men accustomed to bitter cold and harsh landscapes were sent to reinforce the front lines. The Red Army, battered and exhausted, was reborn with a renewed sense of purpose. Discipline hardened, strategies evolved, and leadership adapted under the constant pressure of survival. On the front lines, every battle was a test of endurance. Soldiers fought not only against the enemy but also against hunger, frostbite, and fatigue. Trenches became frozen tombs, forests turned into deadly traps, and rivers became barriers to life-saving retreats. Yet amidst the chaos, acts of heroism emerged. Snipers patiently stalked German officers, engineers rebuilt bridges under bombardment, and partisans sabotaged supply lines deep behind enemy positions. Each small victory, a stalled tank, a defended village, a saved comrade, reminded the Germans that victory was not guaranteed. Moscow itself became the symbol of Soviet resistance. Civilians joined soldiers in the trenches, dug anti-tank obstacles, and helped transport ammunition to the front. Stalin's speeches, broadcast across radio waves, demanded courage, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. The message was clear: the Red Army may bleed, but it would never fall. Morale, once fragile after early defeats, began to harden into collective determination. By the time the Germans reached the outskirts of the capital, winter had already begun to bite. Frost settled over frozen fields and shattered tanks alike. Supplies ran thin, engines failed, and men's bodies froze faster than they could be healed. The first counterattacks, coordinated by newly arrived Siberian divisions, caught the Germans off guard. For the first time, they realized that the Soviet Union was not merely a landmass to conquer. It was a living, breathing force capable of striking back with deadly precision. Despite staggering losses, the Red Army adapted to the brutal conditions and relentless enemy. Commanders learned to exploit every advantage: terrain, weather, and sheer numbers. The Soviets became masters of attrition, trading territory for time, buying the opportunity to regroup, rearm, and strike back. Every village defended, every tank destroyed, and every soldier who survived contributed to the eventual turning of the tide. By the end of the winter campaign, the German advance had stalled. Moscow was secure, though scarred and battered, and the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The Red Army had endured unimaginable losses, but it remained standing. The giant had truly awakened, and the cost of underestimating its resilience would echo through the war for years to come. Winter, the turning point. As 1941 gave way to December, the Eastern Front transformed into a frozen nightmare. The German army, which had swept across the Soviet plains with lightning speed during the summer, now faced the merciless reality of the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, lubricants solidified, and men shivered in tattered uniforms that offered little protection against the biting cold. Tanks became immobile hulks in the snow, and supply trucks sank into mud that would soon turn to ice. Hunger gnawed at the soldiers as rations ran low and ammunition dwindled. Hitler's generals warned him repeatedly. Their forces were exhausted, overextended, and ill-prepared for winter warfare. Yet Hitler refused to delay the advance toward Moscow, convinced that the Soviet capital would fall before the first snow. His arrogance ignored the lessons of history, that Russia's winters were as much a weapon as its armies. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership seized the opportunity the harsh season provided. Siberian divisions, trained to endure extreme cold, were transported to the front lines. These fresh troops arrived fully equipped with winter clothing, experienced in snowbound combat, and ready to fight. Civilians dug trenches, built fortifications, and moved supplies to the city's outskirts. Factories in the Urals and beyond produced tanks, artillery, and rifles with relentless efficiency. Even in despair, the Soviet Union was preparing to strike back. In early December, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. Their advance, once unstoppable, ground to a halt. Snow-clogged roads immobilized vehicles and slowed infantry movements. Soldiers, frozen and fatigued, struggled to maintain formation. Their morale waned as Soviet artillery, hidden snipers, and partisan attacks inflicted steady casualties. Every step forward became a battle against both the enemy and the elements. On December 5th, the long-awaited counteroffensive began. Soviet forces surged from the forests surrounding Moscow, striking the flanks of exhausted German divisions. The Siberian troops, accustomed to the cold, moved with precision and resilience, pushing the invaders back. Tanks that had once seemed unstoppable were abandoned or destroyed in the ice. Ammunition and supply lines, already stretched thin, collapsed under the pressure of relentless attacks. The Germans found themselves fighting not only men but frost, snow, and the unforgiving Russian terrain. For the first time, the Wehrmacht realized that its myth of invincibility had been shattered. What had begun as a swift campaign to crush the Soviet Union had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The winter had become an ally to the Red Army, and a merciless adversary to the invaders. Moscow survived, battered but unbroken, and the first glimmers of hope returned to the Soviet people. By mid-December, German forces were retreating under brutal conditions. Thousands of soldiers froze to death, their bodies abandoned in the snow. Equipment that had carried them across Europe now lay useless. The advance that had seemed unstoppable just months earlier was now in full retreat. Russia's frozen lands had claimed their toll, and the tide of war had begun to turn. The sleeping giant had risen, and the world was beginning to understand that the war would not be won in months, but in years of blood, snow, and unyielding resistance. The giant awakens. By the end of 1941, the consequences of Hitler's overreach were undeniable. Operation Barbarossa, which had begun with unprecedented speed and confidence, had failed to achieve its ultimate objective, the destruction of the Soviet Union. Moscow still stood, the Red Army had endured, and the German army, once perceived as invincible, was in retreat. The winter had exposed the weaknesses of the Wehrmacht: overextended supply lines, frozen equipment, exhausted soldiers, and amplified the resilience of the Soviet defenders. The Germans had underestimated the scale, determination, and adaptability of the Soviet Union. While the early months had brought staggering Soviet losses, the survivors regrouped and strengthened under harsh conditions. Factories churned out tanks, artillery, and rifles. Civilians contributed to the war effort, fortifying cities and transporting essential supplies. Siberian divisions, fresh and trained for the brutal cold, reinforced the front lines, striking at the Germans when they were most vulnerable. Each Soviet counterattack demonstrated the growing competence, unity, and resolve of a nation under siege. Hitler's generals, once confident, now faced harsh reality. The army that had conquered France and Poland was retreating through mud and snow, battered by frostbite, disease, and the relentless Soviet offensive. Morale faltered, and the myth of German invincibility crumbled. Every village reclaimed, every tank destroyed, every ambush executed by Soviet forces underscored that the enemy they faced was not just an army, but a people united and willing to endure unimaginable hardship. The failure to capture Moscow had far-reaching consequences. Strategically, the Germans were forced into a defensive stance for the first time on the Eastern Front. Psychologically, it shattered the aura of inevitability surrounding Hitler's plans. For the Soviets, the survival of their capital was a rallying point. The winter campaign proved that resilience, adaptation, and collective determination could turn the tide of war even against a superior invader. By spring 1942, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. The invaders had awakened a sleeping giant, a Soviet Union determined not only to survive, but to strike back with devastating force. The lessons of the winter, the endurance of ordinary soldiers and civilians, and the unyielding spirit of a nation had transformed the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa had failed, not because of a lack of planning, strategy, or resources, but because it had underestimated the depth, scale, and ferocity of the resistance it faced. June 22, 1941, had marked the beginning of one of the deadliest campaigns in human history. It was also the day that the sleeping giant awoke. The Red Army would not only endure, it would rise, reclaim lost ground, and ultimately turn the course of World War II. The giant had awakened, and the world would never forget the cost of underestimating it.